I don't know. Trying to, you know. Alors, bonjour, merci d'être ici et de vous joindre à nous aujourd'hui. Nous sommes ici pour vous donner une brève mise à jour de la situation concernant les sables bitumineux de Kearl et l'intervention du fédéral pour soutenir les communautés environnantes. Comme je l'ai dit au cours des dernières semaines, je suis très préoccupé par les lacunes entourant le signalement de la situation. As I've said over the past few weeks, I'm very concerned about the reporting gaps. The seepage was not communicated to affected communities in a timely or appropriate way by the company or provincial regulator. This demonstrates that the system did not work in this case and needs to be examined and strengthened. Our immediate priority remains the health and well-being of the people of the Athabasca Chippewa First Nation, the Mikisew First Nations, and the Fort Chippewa Métis Nation, as well as other communities. I have been in direct contact with Chief Alam Adam of the Athabasca Chippewa First Nation, as well as Chief Billy Joe Takoro from the Mikisew First Nation on several occasions. We are working together across the federal government to make sure the community's needs are fully met, and I will let Minister Hajdu provide more details on that. Practical matters like providing safe, drinkable water are urgent and pressing, and we're on it. Les agents d'application de la Loi d'environnement et changement climatique Canada continuent de surveiller le site. Ils ont transmis une directive à la Société impériale lui demandant de prendre des mesures immédiates pour prévenir toute fuite de produits chimiques dans les eaux où vivent des poissons. Ces représentants surveillent les travaux de nettoyage et recueillent plus d'informations à l'issue d'inspections. J'ai aussi parlé directement avec la ministre Sonia Savage du gouvernement de l'Alberta et mon cabinet a reçu des renseignements de la Société impériale. Enforcement officers from Environment and Climate Change Canada continue to monitor the site. They issued a directive to the Imperial Corporation asking them to take immediate action to prevent any leakage of chemicals into waters frequented by fish. And I have proposed creating a joint federal-provincial Indigenous working group with participation from the oil companies. This working group would meet on a regular basis to give information in a transparent manner to all parties involved and discuss remediation and containment plans, as well as improve the notification for ongoing incidents of spill or seepage. The exact mandate and makeup of this working group is still being worked out. But we know that improvements need to be made to the company and provincial communication protocol for environmental emergencies notifications. We're taking steps to ensure the immediate risk is addressed and that we are facilitating a process that rebuilds trust with Indigenous communities so we can take credible long-term reclamation and reconciliation planning together. I will also like to salute the members of the Parliamentary Committee who just passed a motion to have both Imperial Oil and the Alberta Energy Regulator testify at a committee soon. Notre gouvernement a également été clair. La participation des communautés autochtones devra être plus importante dans nos futures interventions. Les communautés autochtones, les municipalités et les gouvernements fédéraux et provinciaux travaillent en collaboration pour régler tout ce qui touche la surveillance des eaux environnantes, l'amélioration des échanges d'informations, la salubrité de l'eau potable et les solutions au traitement à long terme des bassins de décantation et de stockage des stériles et des boues. Mes collègues ainsi que moi-même poursuivrons nos efforts jusqu'à ce que ce soit fait. Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much. I would now like to cede the microphone to my colleague, Minister Hajdu.
Well, thanks very much, Minister Guilbeault. First of all, I have spoken with Chief Adams and Chief Takoro as well, and they're devastated and their communities are devastated, and they're afraid. They're afraid that the water is contaminated. They have no trust or faith that the testing results are accurate, given the fact that both leaders and communities feel that they've been misled over the number of months that they haven't had information from either the Alberta government or Imperial Oil. And they're worried about the long-term sustainability of their way of life. Many community members hunt for subsistence, have been eating meat and other fish that they've gathered over the number of months that this seepage and leak has been occurring. So there's concerns about long-term health impact. And there's really just a complete lack of faith that the water is safe. So in the interim, Indigenous Services Canada is providing potable, drinkable water, bottled water, and covering all the costs to ensure that communities have water in the near future. Actually, the water has arrived in some cases and is on the way in others, but we will continue to provide that over the next period of time. We were also asked to provide specific mental health resources. As you can imagine, this is devastating emotionally, and not just from the trust perspective, but from the devastation of the land. And I think as we talk about mental health for First Nations people, often we focus on the history of colonization, rightfully so, things like residential schools and disruption of family and language and culture, but devastation of land has a significant and immediate deleterious effect on Indigenous peoples who, since time immemorial, have had a connection with that land and a sense of a shared stewardship with all of the beings that exist. So we'll continue to be there for communities with the mental health supports that they need, and we'll be there with communities as they determine for themselves what it is that will help them both from a trust perspective and from a healing perspective. Thank you.
Hi, Minister. I've got two separate questions for you. The first is the UN report on oil and gas that's come out. There's a request to stop oil and gas expansion. How soon will Canada move away from the public funding of oil and gas projects?
Well, thank you for the question. As you know, today the IPCC is issuing its synthesis report, which compiles a year of scientific knowledge, not just on oil and gas, obviously, but on climate change more broadly, of which oil and gas is an important component. As you know, at the end of last year, we eliminated international fossil fuel subsidies, and we have made a commitment that by the middle of this year, we would eliminate domestic fossil fuel subsidies. Doing so 2 years before our G20 partners. The G20 is committed to eliminating fossil fuel subsidies by 2025. Canada will be doing it in 2023.
The second subject I have is for my colleagues in Alberta who are asking about C-69 being at the Supreme Court this week. Do you have any observations on those proceedings?
No comments, obviously, as it's being discussed this week in front of the Supreme Court. Thank you.
The IPCC suggests that in order to maintain or have a hope for 1.5, we need to be net zero by 2040, not 2050. Is that a workable goal for Canada?
As you know, this is a new statement by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Most of the world right now, I mean, there's about 67 or 70 countries in the world that have adopted net zero commitment for 2050. This is a new request from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, obviously one that we will study very carefully in Canada. It's one thing to simply say, well, you know, we want to reach this goal, but we have to give ourselves the means to get there, and we do that now in Canada for 2050. We will obviously need to take a second long, hard look at what the IPCC is proposing for 2040.
On today's announcement, can you please address how it is that 9 months after this seeping, leaking happened, we still don't know how much has even been released into the environment? How is it that, like, we're nearing in on a year and we still have no information about how serious this is?
As I've said before, clearly the system we have in place is failing. The communities weren't notified before February of seepage that was taking place since May of 2022. Environment and Climate Change Canada either wasn't notified until February. As I said earlier, we have enforcement agents from the Enforcement Branch of Environment and Climate Change Canada that are taking samples on the site right now. But the reason the federal government is proposing that we change the way we do monitoring and communication on the tailing ponds is specifically because in this instance, the system didn't work.
You are responsible for the system, and your own government, your Liberal MPs in the Environment
We're not
Committee,
actually. We're
your
not actually.
Liberal MPs on the Environment Committee voted just 2 months ago to remove tailing ponds from the SEPA update. And so you could have then had more leverage to request information proactively, to have more of a role in oversight.
As you're well aware, the system as it is that companies need to communicate any leakage or seepage to the Alberta regulator, who then communicates it to the federal government. This is a provincial jurisdiction over which the federal government also has a role to play. I'm not saying we don't have a role to play here, but we don't have all the levers. And what I'm proposing is that we all sit together, Indigenous nations, federal government, Alberta government, as well as industry, to ensure that going forward, we have a better system. En français?
Monsieur Guilbeault, concernant le rapport du GIEC, premièrement, il y a cette demande de ramener à 2040 la carboneutralité. Est-ce que le gouvernement du Canada est prêt à le faire, à investir là-dedans? Puis, je vais vous poser la question en combo. Est-ce que vous vous engagez également, comme il est demandé, de cesser de subventionner donc de nouveaux projets ou d'approuver même de nouveaux projets pétroliers au Canada?
Alors, comme vous le savez, nous avons pris l'engagement d'éliminer les subventions aux combustibles fossiles 2 ans plus tôt que nos partenaires du G20. Donc, l'engagement est de les éliminer d'ici 2025 au G20. Nous le ferons au Canada en 2023. Nous avons déjà éliminé à la fin de 2022 les subventions internationales. Ce qui nous reste à faire, c'est les subventions domestiques, d'une part. D'autre part, jusqu'à la parution de ce rapport-là, la demande du GIEC et de la communauté scientifique internationale était pour les pays d'atteindre la carboneutralité en 2050, ce à quoi le Canada s'est engagé. Nous avons d'ailleurs un projet de loi qui a été adopté dans cette Chambre là-dessus. C'est une nouvelle demande que le GIEC nous pose aujourd'hui, nous fait d'atteindre cette carboneutralité-là en 2040. C'est évidemment quelque chose que nous allons devoir regarder très sérieusement au Canada et très rapidement.
Est-ce que c'est possible de le faire? Est-ce que c'est atteignable?
Bien, évidemment, c'est une chose de dire, bon, il faut une cible pour 2040. Après ça, il faut se donner les moyens de le faire d'un point de vue législatif, réglementaire, d'un point de vue des investissements. Comme vous avez pu le constater, et ce n'est pas juste moi qui le dis, mais plusieurs représentants de groupes écologistes ont affirmé publiquement récemment que nous n'avons jamais vu un tel rythme de déploiement de mesures de lutte au changement climatique que celles que nous voyons présentement au Canada. En termes d'investissement, en termes de législation, en termes fiscaux, on pense notamment à la tarification carbone. Donc, nous allons poursuivre ce travail-là, mais maintenant, il faut regarder ce que le GIEC nous demande de faire de plus.
On the oil camp, the Mikisew First Nation sent a detailed request list to the Prime Minister over the weekend. Is the government going to accept all of those requests? Have you decided yet? They include moving the water intake to a safer location, funding a health study, a tailings ponds audit of all tailings ponds in the area, and training, monitoring, and, quote, real solutions for tailings ponds. Has the government already accepted it? What's the response to one of the First Nations that is there?
So I would tell you that overall we agree with those requests. We need to look at them in detail and what the role is for the federal government to play in regards to each of those requests. But we agree with them. We need a better monitoring system. We agree with them. We need to have transparent, independent, timely information on any seepage or leakage with the tailing ponds. And we also agree with them. And in fact, we are working with Indigenous nations on a long-term solution to the tailing ponds. The idea that we can simply continue to park large quantities of toxic water in these giant ponds is not a long-term solution to this. We need to find a long-term solution, but it's not up just to the federal government. We need to sit down with our Indigenous partners and other stakeholders to find long-term solutions. En français, c'était quoi le début de la question, pardon?
My question was around the Mikisew First Nation.
Oui, d'accord. Alors, le gouvernement fédéral a reçu cette fin de semaine une demande de la communauté Mikisew de Fort Chipewyan qui nous demande de poser un certain nombre de gestes, plusieurs de ces gestes-là auxquels nous nous sommes déjà engagés, donc la mise sur pied d'un groupe conjoint de travail qui permettra à tous les acteurs d'avoir en temps rapide une information fiable sur la situation avec l'eau contaminée dans ces lacs artificiels-là, d'une part. Donc, de façon générale, nous sommes très d'accord avec les demandes. On va devoir les regarder spécifiquement et voir quel rôle le gouvernement fédéral peut faire pour répondre à chacune de ces demandes-là. Mais l'idée qu'on peut continuer comme ça d'accumuler de l'eau toxique dans ces lacs, dans ces immenses lacs artificiels-là n'est pas une solution à long terme. Et ça, je pense que tout le monde s'entend là-dessus. Les peuples autochtones s'entendent là-dessus. Je pense que si vous parlez aux gens de l'industrie, ils vont vous dire que ce n'est pas une solution à long terme non plus. Et certainement, nous au niveau du gouvernement fédéral, voulons trouver une solution durable d'un point de vue écologique, d'un point de vue santé publique à ce problème-là.
We've heard these dire warnings for years now, and every time it seems that there's not enough progress, it's not done fast enough. What do you think the holdup is? Is it that there's not enough political will around the world? Do you think people have just resigned the fact that climate change is going to happen and there's not much more that we can really do?
You're talking about climate change or tailing ponds?
The climate change and the new UN report.
I was at COP1 in 1995 in Berlin, and then many activists and scientists were saying we needed to do more to fight climate change. Very few countries were listening at the time. Very few people were listening at the time. I think now we see that things are different. You have countries all around the world putting in place measures to fight climate change in ways we've never seen before. I was recently meeting with the head of the IEA who was saying that despite everything we're seeing in Europe, there was more investment last year in renewable energy and clean technologies than in fossil fuels. We are at the beginning of a new era where we will be less and less dependent on fossil fuels. We will be using more clean technologies, more renewable energy, but the question is how fast can we collectively deploy those measures to keep temperature increases as far as possible below 2 degrees Celsius and as much as possible around 1.5 degrees Celsius, as per the Paris Agreement requires us to do.
Emitters on board, because a lot of the big emitters, China, Russia, still are not investing enough in clean energy.
I think no one is investing enough in clean energy. I think we all need to do better, which is why Canada decided to step up to the plate in December and host COP15 on biodiversity, which we know is one of the best solutions to find climate change. Nature is our best ally. And we did that working with China, knowing that it would be difficult because our relationship with the Chinese government hasn't been the best over the last few years. But we decided to do that because we felt we had a responsibility to help and the international community and to step up, and that's exactly what Canada's doing.
The IPCC said that by...
I'm sorry, he hasn't asked a question.
Yeah, the report says, the world needs to get closer to net zero, but closer to 2040 instead of 2050. Yes. Is that possible for Canada?
As I said earlier, this is a new request from the IPCC. As of now, the request was to be net zero by 2050, which is what Canada has done. We've adopted legislation to do just that. So we will need to look carefully at this new request from the IPCC and see how we could try and reach net zero by 2040.
The IPCC has also said that we need clean energy or clean electricity, by 2035. Canada is aiming for that, but they say the IPCC says it has to be done without natural gas-fired power plants. Is Canada aiming to get rid of gas-fired power by 2035?
So as you know, we're working on regulations to have a net zero electricity system by 2035. So if there still are fossil fuels being used to produce electricity in 2035, all of the emissions would have to be offsetted or captured. So from an emissions point of view, from an atmospheric point of view, we would see no new net increase in emissions from the electricity sector, which I think pretty much is what the IPCC is asking us to do, and Canada's doing it.
So if there's no real consequences to companies like Imperial's, these oil spills, why would you think they're going to improve their reporting?
There is an active investigation by the Enforcement Branch of Environment and Climate Change Canada, so I can't comment on the specific question you're asking. More broadly, as I said, we need to have a better system of reporting and communicating on tailing ponds and tailing pond seepage and leakages.
Fair enough, but why not shut it down in the meantime while it's being investigated?
As you know, the exploitation of natural resources is a provincial jurisdiction, but I'm not saying that to say that the federal government has no role to play. We clearly have a role to play, which is why we're here today, talking about all these things we are doing to address this problem.
But sir, I think the question is, you're saying this is a provincial jurisdiction, but you're also acknowledging a federal role.
Yes.
And in the federal oversight that your government and previous governments have agreed to and accepted, it has allowed this to happen. And so I wonder again if you could address how it is that the federal government okayed a system in which 9 months after a leak started, Imperial Oil still can't answer how much has been released but maintains that it's safe.
I'm going to tell you why. Because under the previous government, Canada dismantled impact assessment in Canada. And we changed that with C-69. And right now, this week, we will be in court on the fact that 9 out of 10 provinces are challenging the fact that we should have better impact assessment in Canada. God forbid that we would have impact assessment where we hear concerns from Indigenous nations, where we work with them to assess projects that have impact on their daily lives. God forbid that we would have impact assessment in Canada that tackles climate change, which we couldn't do under the previous regime that the Harper government put in place. And the processes that we have in place, right now in Alberta on monitoring of tailing ponds are a result of what the previous government did, and we're working really hard to change that, including fighting all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada. Merci beaucoup. Thank you. Merci beaucoup.
Can you explain why the federal government is paying for Imperial Oil's mistakes? Why is the federal government paying for bottled water? Why isn't Imperial Oil?
Well, I think it would be a mistake to not do anything and fight about who's paying for what when people are scared to drink the water. So the federal government is stepping into the void, quite frankly, and providing clean water while the community is distressed about the safety of its water, and we're saving all our receipts.
So did you ask Imperial Oil to pay? You say you're stepping into the void. Can you just illuminate a bit what that void is?
The response from my department has been to support First Nations communities in a seamless way. I'm saving all the receipts.
Thank you.